Say his name and he appears, I believe, in the OG GM because he's awesome. It is Friday afternoon. We're going to the market. It is gorgeous. It's a perfect day. Let's ruin it by talking about our hobby. Now, earlier today, I already did the whole let's bag on the artwork thing. So I think I've devoted enough energy to specific things about Wizards of the Coast. So I'm going to ignore the whole gentrification, misogyny, racist, sexist, Gygax was a horrible, evil human being, because other people are covering that this weekend, and it's been done to death, right? My shoe's untied. Instead, because tomorrow is free RPG day, we're going to talk about free RPGs and stuff. And we're going to have to go, and previous videos that I have done before where I talked about topics. So we're going to revisit one of my very first. Oops. Howdy, sir. Drive careful, please. Hi, how are you?
Hi.
One of the very first videos I made back in 2015, 2016. You might remember this video because of a certain individual who responded it. And this is my what is a dungeon? What is an adventure? Really? Because the hobby is based upon a game called Dungeons and Dragons. That name was just something that came out of, random spitballing. I believe it was Gygax's daughter who came up with the name. And it started the long history of games had to be a name, an and symbol, and then a different name. And oh my God, if you look at the history of ways people have tried to tie words together using the ampersand or whatever, the and symbol. And sometimes they make sense, villains and vigilantes. Other times, not so much. And the fact that 50 years later, people are still trying to, how can I fit two words together so they work, like Dungeons and Dragons? Because Dungeons and Dragons, even if you had no idea what it was, it instantly just evokes certain imagery in your head, right? I think we all have an image in our mind of what a dragon is, and we all have an image in our mind of what a dungeon is, thanks to movies, TVs, video games, comic books, and stuff like that. I'm gonna tie my shoe. I don't know why this happens to me so much. I should just double knot, huh? The other one's gonna come on tight in a second. So we have this image in our mind of what a dungeon is, but that's actually incorrect. The term dungeon or doujon, I believe, comes from French, and basically just it's hole in the ground with cage. Because if you've ever been to the Tower of London or in any of the actual dungeon historical sites that are still standing up, or if you've ever gone to jail, that's what a dungeon is. The dungeons are not vast, sprawling, eldritch complexes filled with ancient secrets and treasure and mysterious cults. No, they're usually just a hole in the ground. If you're lucky, they paved the walls and a gate. It was a place to put prisoners. It was a place to put people you didn't want to remember. Even the Tower of London, Anne Boleyn's chamber in the Tower of London, the teeny, the stairs up to the dungeon of the Tower of London are one person stairs. Dungeons aren't what we think they are. They're basically jails. Think of a jail that's underground. Not even like underground, like just below. As little work as we could do to dig this hole, put a door on it, and throw prisoners in there, that is a dungeon. Now, it's hard to tell where the idea transferred probably from, pulp writers like Conan books and even Lord of the Rings and a lot of the early fantasy. You would have them going into caves. You would have the evil wizard in a tomb or something like that. We had just discovered the pyramids, right? And we were just getting an idea of the complexes inside some of the pyramids. And we just discovered the necropolis in France and an idea of how big that thing is. And we just discovered the underground cities in places like Turkey and South America and Peru and all these places where either, things had been built up over or things had sunk or whatever. So historically, late 60s, early 70s, there's all these science fiction and fantasy books talking about this, and then in real life, we're just brushing the surface of some of these ancient places and seeing that, hey, there is a building under here. There is a large tomb under here. There's a frickin' city of skulls under here. So that's probably where the transition from jail to what we now think of a dungeon is. Now, it's been argued that really, a dungeon only really needs to be 5 rooms, maybe even 3 rooms. What the perfect size is, what's the difference between a dungeon and a mega dungeon? Is it still a dungeon if it's above ground? Is it still a dungeon if it's on a boat? Is the Death Star a dungeon? So really, when we ask what defines a dungeon in terms to role-playing, it's not the structure. A dungeon is anything where an external force, the dungeon master, the game master, controls the ways you can get into it and the ways you can get out to it. And when I originally posted this argument, I posted because I knew, okay, people might not know what the Tower of London looks like, but most people know what the Death Star looks like. So I was like, the Death Star's a dungeon. Oh boy, did that piss off some super people. But really, it is, by definition, a dungeon, other than the fact it's not underground. But in that there are only limited ways in to the Death Star. There's only very limited ways out of the Death Star. There is a X amount of finite things you're going to encounter in the Death Star. Like if the Death Star's got a crew of 150 stormtroopers, you kill all 150 stormtroopers, you're not going to run into any more stormtroopers. That's it. You've dealt with every encounter. And once you've gone through the Death Star, you have a general idea of what the inside of the Death Star looks like. And, you're like, well, I got the plans. Do we have to go back? Is there any... The dungeon has told its story. You don't really need to go back. If you've accomplished all the beats of the story, do you have to go back to the dungeon? So, rationalizing that because people knew what it was. But basically, it's anything that your players, your audience, have limited ability to get into, limited ability to get out of. It's got defined borders that they can't exit. I mean, a forest is a dungeon if you make it so they can't leave the certain specific areas. Basically, whether you have a physical wall or a metaphysical wall, there is something in place so the options of directions that they can go are limited. The second thing that defines a dungeon, of course, is why are you there? And that can range from very specific rescue the princess, retrieve the stolen artifacts, stop the evil sorcerer, locate the missing miners. You have a very specific go in, do this, leave, to, I don't know, let's just go in this hole in the ground and beat up orcs because we're bored. Very general. But there's a reason why you're there. That's the second thing that would define a dungeon. The dungeon has a very specific story to tell. And that story has a beginning, a middle, and an end. And when you've accomplished the finite goals of the dungeon, you will usually leave the dungeon. And generally there's no reason to go back. Once you've dealt with the Sandwich Lord, stolen everything from the temple of the Sandwich Lord, unless you want to turn it into your house, why go back? Do you have a reason to go back? No, not really. Because the Death Star, the dungeon of the Sandwich Lord, the dungeon has told its story. You've accomplished the goals. It had a beginning, a middle, and end. So that's the third thing that defines the dungeon. Beyond that, it's pretty much just whatever. After that, it's just sort of amorphous blob that you mold to tell your story. Sure, it could be underground, but it could also be in a spaceship, it could be a boat, it could be some weird non-Euclidean dimensional portal. It could just be one big space. It could be lots of little spaces that are interconnected. It could be very small with only like 3-5 rooms. It could be, the size of a sprawling city with hundreds of rooms and hundreds of directions you could go. As long as the place where you have it can justify the size within the limited logic of gaming. But yeah, that's, once you have those things, those center points, everything else is just sort of window dressing, really. Traps, tricks, puzzles, wandering monsters, weird, quirky, iconic encounters. That's the window dressing. Those are things that are there either to help facilitate the story or just because they're cool. And which brings us to the fourth and final thing of a dungeon. You can put things in a dungeon that are there just because they're cool. And they don't have to fit the logic of the universe always. Going back to our Death Star. Why the scene with them swinging over the bridge? Why was that even there? A giant hole going through the center of my space station seems like a structural weakness. Was that an elevator? Why was it there? Because it was cool. Why is there the scene where the controls for the Death Star shields are in the middle of this island guarded by 2 stormtroopers instead of in the control room with everything else? There's no reason to just put that there other than it's cool. It was cool. And a dungeon allows you to throw things in that are visually cool, and they necessarily don't have to have anything to do with the story or even the logic of the universe. You will forgive it because it's cool. So, what is a dungeon in terms of our hobby? Because you could make a dungeon for your space game, your Old West game, your horror game, your superhero game, your colonial gothic game, your fantasy game, whatever you want. The things that define a dungeon, again, are limited ability to leave. Usually only 1 or 2 ways to get in, 1 or 2 ways to get out, and there's only so far you can go. There will be borders. You can't just walk in a straight direction and walk out, unless that's, of course, part of the dungeon. But no, there are clearly defined borders. It could be the walls, it could be a force field, it could just be impossible gaps, raging rivers, whatever, depending upon if it's inside or outside. But you, the DM, control how the players, how the protagonists can move through the story and what they encounter the story. The second thing that defines a dungeon is it's finite. There are only so many rooms. There are only so many stormtroopers. There are only so many things you can do for the dungeon to tell its story. And once it's told its story, there's no real reason to go back. Once you've slain the Lich, is there any reason to go back? Unless, you're that one guy who's like, I'm going to turn that into my house. Or that guy who's like, I don't know, there was like that 5x5 square we didn't search. We might have missed something. We need to go back. But other than that, there's no reason to go back. Is there? And then, of course, in a dungeon, you can have things that are there just because they're cool. The dungeon will have its own ecosystem, its own personality, but it has a very specific story to tell. And that specific story could be anything from kick open the door, kill the monsters, take their shit, to something very specific like rescue the princess, get the plans for the Death Star, etc., etc., etc. What is a dungeon in terms of our hobby? It is a structure, real or fictional, that you, the DM, control completely, and the players have very little ability to leave it. The dungeon has a very specific story to tell, and once it's told that story, there's no real reason to go back. There's a finite number of things you're going to encounter in that dungeon. And once you've killed those 10 orcs, that's it. There's no more orcs. The only way for more mooks to get in would be if they came from the outside and came in the same way you came in. And of course, the dungeon allows you to occasionally stretch your imagination and throw something in simply because it's cool, like talking statues, magical fountains, the controls for the force field in the middle of an island, in the middle of a gigantic floorless room, where why isn't this in the control room with all the other controls? Why is it down here in the middle of nowhere? Because it's cool. Because it's cool. The rule of cool. You don't have to always explain. It's a dungeon. I don't have to explain it. If I'm powerful enough to have dug all this out, I'm powerful enough to stretch my imagination and toss in something ridiculous. So, obviously my definition has changed since the original definition, but the point is still, in thinking in those terms, if you want to design a dungeon, you're not limited to hole in the ground filled with monsters and traps. The only real limits you have is, what is the story this space is telling? Why are they there? And what are the boundaries? What are the exits? What are the entrances? How big? How far? How long? What's the environment? Those limited options inside that intangible space is what makes your dungeon. And once you've got that written down on paper, then the rest is just window dressing. Then you could add the doors and the chambers and the rooms and the traps and the wandering monsters and the talking statues and the trash compactor and the all the cool shit. And if occasionally the cool shit doesn't make sense, why is it there? I don't know. I don't have to explain everything. So that is revisiting one of the very first dungeon module, the first talks I ever did when I started this experiment. And since it is Free RPG Day, I thought we'd revisit it. Do you agree? Do you disagree? What's your definition of a dungeon? What's your favorite real world dungeon? And, just what are you thinking on this Free RPG Day Origins weekend? Anyways, I've about reached my destination. Hopefully you appreciated me taking you along with you. Me, you, blah. If you do, let me know. If you never want to do this ever again, let me know. I'm the OG GM. Have a great day.